Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. My name is Ari, and today we're going to have some more stories about our toxic life. But before we start, it would be so much appreciated if you would subscribe to my channel, like the video, if you enjoy it, and maybe leave a comment down below. These simple clicks would mean a lot to the future of this channel and really reward the effort that I put in every day. And now without further ado, let's go. Today's first story. In this story, Opie recounts his 10-year relationship with his wife, who always dreamed of becoming a mother. Despite multiple pregnancies ending in miscarriages, their bond eroded. After discovering his wife was having an affair with his best friend Greg, who promised her a child, he exposed them, filed for divorce, and cut ties, ultimately starting a new life. Now let's get into the story. My wife, 32 female, and I, 35 male, have always wanted kids. We tried our hardest to make this a dream. She mentioned to me early on when we started dating how she wanted to be a mom. This was 10 years ago, and I told her that if we got married, I would make that dream a reality. She said she would like that. So 5 years into dating, we got married. It was a small ceremony, but my wife and I weren't the showy types. We like to keep things simple. I had a job at a bank, and she worked as a graphic designer at a company. I know she and my best friend Greg worked together because he was the marketing director. He had a girlfriend that he loved deeply, and we would go out on double dates together. Greg also knew how much I wanted to be a father and constantly supported me. My wife and I tried, and for a while, we did everything we could to get pregnant. From different home remedies to even talking to doctors. However, no matter how much we tried, it didn't work. I was desperate, and while we didn't want to do IVF, if we could, it almost came down to it. My wife was growing upset because of this. She told me to take a sperm test, but I was told I was healthy as a horse. She was healthy too. One night, after talking, I said that I would pray and see if maybe God would answer. I'm not religious, but I did it for her. Perhaps it was out of desperation or something else. Then about a month later, my wife missed her period. We thought it was it. We took a pregnancy test, and she was pregnant. We were so happy about this, and I was ecstatic. However, we lost it shortly after. My wife was devastated, but I told her that we would try again. We always could. We tried again a couple months later. She did get pregnant, but then she lost it. We're not sure why. I told her the third time's the charm. So it was. On our third attempt, she was pregnant. The doctor monitored her like a hawk to make sure her baby lived. We went through the first 8 weeks with no problem. We held our breath as she went through the first trimester. She made it. By week 12, the doctor believed we were in the clear. He also told us that we'd be having twins. To think after all of this trying, all of these attempts, we finally had twins. I told Greg, and he was happy. My wife was glowing. Everything seemed like it was perfect until week 24. My wife woke me up in the middle of the night, panicking because she didn't feel the babies moving or kicking. She cried out in pain and raced to the bathroom. She went to the bathroom and she reported there was blood. We immediately went to the ER. Sure enough, she lost the babies. The doctor had to dilate her to evacuate them, removing them from the uterus. They induced partial labor into her. After it was over, my wife was hollow, like she lost a part of herself. After that, everything changed. She didn't want to try again, not after the last time. It traumatized her. It killed me inside. I wanted to help her, to be there for her. I took her out to dinner, double dating with Greg and his girlfriend. It surprised me that Greg wasn't engaged, but he told me that they were in the process of getting a house so they could move out of their place. After that, my wife drowned herself in her work. I tried to get her to come down and watch movies or go out, but she didn't want to. Greg was busy as well. I thought about asking Greg if my wife was acting all right, but he said she was just a little stressed out. They had a huge deadline to work with. My wife was constantly gone, and when she came back, she seemed almost exasperated with me. I asked her what I did wrong, and she said nothing. I saved some money and asked her if we should try IVF. She said no, she didn't want to. It made me upset because it felt like I was the problem. Maybe I was, but I even had doctors check me out to make sure everything was okay. My wife became different, almost like a shell of a person. She would hide her phone, becoming more secretive. One night, while she was showering, I needed to find my phone. I pressed to find my Android function. A phone rang, but it wasn't mine. It was my wife's, which she left in a bag. Curiosity got the better of me when I opened it. I turned it off, but I saw text messages from Greg on there. They didn't show up on the lock screen, but they were there when the home screen appeared. They were 40 texts. I opened up the rest of the messages. Sure enough, they were more of the same. Pictures were sent, and my wife even said Greg could put a baby in her. Greg mentioned that his girlfriend was nice, but he could make her dreams come true of being a mom. It disgusted me. I spent all this time with that dream, only to hear my best friend doing this. I had to get back at them. One night, while she worked late, I set up my plan. I placed an order for a marketing strategy using a fake name. I came after hours, despite them saying they were closed. The door was open, and I walked inside. When I got to the floor where she worked, I heard sounds. They were having intimate. I speed inside, red in the face, as Greg literally said to my wife he would put a baby in her. I was livid. I told my wife she was a cheater, and I knew everything. She begged and pleaded with me to listen, saying that Greg could be a surrogate for them, but I was disgusted. She cheated on me, all because she wanted something that I couldn't give to her. When I got home, I packed my things and got a hotel. I took video evidence and sent it to her boss, firing both of them after the divorce went through. I got everything. My wife cheated, and I spent all this time thinking it was a problem, when really it was her. I sold the house and got a condo far away, working at another bank. I'm not dating anymore. I don't want to after all that happened. Greg and I aren't friends anymore. I told his girlfriend and they broke up. I don't know what happened to Greg and my wife. Maybe they got together. Maybe not. All I knew was with no house and no job, their lives were much harder. Today's second story. In this story, OP's wife became friendly with AP, despite the husband's concerns. Suspicions led him to install cameras, revealing an affair between his wife and AP. After a confrontation and forced separation, the exes moved out of state and eventually split up, while he and his child thrived on their farm. Now, let's get into the story. My wife, 26 female, and I, 29 male, got married and rented our first apartment for 5 years. We bought our first house when our child was a year and a half old. It was a farmhouse that was in foreclosure. The previous owner had split it into a duplex due to the financial hardships they faced. There was another couple living in half of the house when we first moved in. They had 90 days left to vacate. We didn't get to meet or see them at first, but the reality agent told me they homeschooled their kids and lived here for years. Everything was blissful at first. My wife helped me to start unpacking and settling into our new home together. Even our little boy helped us to carry in his toys one at a time. We could finally own animals, so within the first month we got a horse, cow, and chickens. The three of us spent time with our animals. My wife and I took turns riding the horse with our son. While we were out enjoying one of the last days I had off work, something caught my wife's eye. I matched her gaze and saw a very healthy-looking man. He was making shopping firewood look easy. I assumed he was our neighbor, but even though he saw us, he didn't say anything. I wondered if he was bitter with me for buying the house that he had been renting for his wife and children for so long. I wondered if they had found a new home or if they were desperate to stay where they were. I was a nice man, and if they wanted to introduce themselves, they could. My wife was still staring at him, so I told her to stop. She blushed. I thought about introducing us, but I just wanted my wife to stay away from Mr. Woodshop. While I was at work the next week, my wife told me she got to hang out with a neighbor for a bit. I asked her which one, which caught her off guard for some reason. She admitted it was Mr. Poole, while Mrs. Poole was upstairs taking a nap with their kids. She always napped at the same time every day because her medicine exhausted her. I was uncomfortable, and she looked embarrassed. I asked what they did, and she said they just played cards and talked about the benefits of living in the countryside. I thought it was weird, and I told her not to spend time with them alone. She rolled her eyes, smiled, and told me not to worry. I asked her if she thought it was funny to spend time alone with another married man. She put her serious face on, but I felt like she was pleased that I was jealous. She told me I needed to trust her and that she would never cheat on me. I told her I didn't want her to spend time with him alone. She agreed, but only because she saw how upset I was getting. I didn't believe for one second that she understood my reasoning behind it. She denied any wrongdoing. I was off work unexpectedly one day, a week after my wife hung out with a neighbor. I answered a knock at the door. My wife tried to tell me she would answer it, but I was closer, so I answered it. It was Mr. Poller with a bouquet of flowers. I took them confused. He stammered to explain that they were a goodbye gift from his wife. My wife accepted them, looking quite embarrassed. I told him it was nice to finally meet him, and I introduced myself as my wife's husband, putting my arm around her shoulders and squeezing. She was bright red, staring at the flower petals. Mr. Poole then wished us a good evening before fleeing. I put my wife on the spot by asking her why he brought her flowers. She stammered, saying she didn't know why. I told her I didn't believe they were from Mrs. Poole, and she had the nerve to tell me that I was overreacting and thinking too hard about this. She wanted me to drop it and reminded me that I had to work the next day. I was officially suspicious that something was happening between my wife and the neighbor. I installed cameras inside and outside of our house that night, refusing to go to bed until I was done. My wife hated this. She asked me if it would take up all of our solar power, and I said no. She asked me if someone could hack in her camera feed, and I said no. She asked if I could watch her remotely, and I said yes. I got a live feed from it on my phone. She seemed very displeased for some reason, but tried to recover by saying it made her feel safer. I started watching my wife while I worked. For a week and a half, nothing interesting happened, and I just found it nice to be able to check in on my wife and son while I worked. I started to check the live camera feed less often. Weeks later, I decided to check the feed while I ate lunch. My son was sleeping in his crib while my wife was typing on her phone. She set it down, took a pie out of the oven, and headed next door with a big smile on her face. She was let inside quickly. She was on their side of the house for a while. I could not believe it. When I got home, I asked her what she did, and she said she talked to Mrs. Poole about homeschooling. I didn't believe her, so I went next door, despite my wife trying to say that Mrs. Poole was sleeping now. I thought it was weird that she was trying to tell me she was sleeping. I knocked on the door and was greeted by Mr. Poller. I asked to speak with Mrs. Poller so I could corroborate my wife's story. He was immediately defensive and said I didn't need to speak to his wife. I could just speak to him. I decided to jump in full force and tell them I knew he was sleeping with my wife. It was like he was surprised I said it, but had a planned defense. He smiled nervously and said that was an unfair accusation. That's when his wife started coming down the stairs, rubbing her eyes. She asked what was going on. I asked her if she spoke to my wife earlier in the day, but her husband yelled over me, saying he already answered my question. Then he slammed the door in my face. I heard them yelling inside, but no one came outside to talk to me. I slept on the couch that night, unsure of what to do. My wife only maintained the same story she told me before for a few days. Nothing interesting happened. I would check the camera feed at work, and my wife was at home. Then when I least expected it, my wife went back over to their house at the same time as before, this time with cookies. She was inside for 30 minutes before I decided to go home and see what was happening. I figured since I own the house now, I could get away with opening the front door. As soon as I did, I saw my wife and Mr. Poller having intimate on their couch. My wife wailed now and started crying immediately, just as quickly as she started trying to put her clothes back on. Mr. Poller was frantically trying to dress too, furious with me for opening his front door. The yelling and crying and my claiming to be right all along caused Mrs. Poller to wake up and come downstairs with the kids. They weren't fully dressed yet, so she immediately assumed the worst. I told her I just caught them having intimate, which really sent her into a spiral of grief. She accused him of breaking vows, breaking her heart, breaking her trust, and breaking apart the family. The kids started crying due to the stress of the situation. We both kicked out our spouses, despite their lies, objections, and grief. My wife tried to say it was a stupid mistake, blaming the temptation of having another man right next door. Instead of taking accountability for the fact that she cheated on me, her loving, loyal husband and provider, I screamed it in her face. I told her she cheated on me, since she was having trouble accepting this truth. I told her I wouldn't allow myself to be disrespected in such a way, and I wouldn't call her my wife ever again. In the midst of the yelling and sadness, I ushered her back to her side of the house and forced her to pack her clothes. She was mortified. She didn't want to leave the place we just bought and called home. She didn't want to leave her son and didn't know where she would go. I told her AP should take care of her, since whatever they had was more important than 2 long-term marriages with children. She sobbed, shaking her head, admitting that the affair wasn't as valuable as maintaining a happy and successful marriage. She begged me for forgiveness. Just one more chance to be my wife and have the family and life we expected to have. I told her that life and expectations was gone. The love was too. I didn't want to love her because she chose to love another man. My wife was a shaking, sobbing mess when she left at the same time as AP with their cars packed. It was a terrible, life-altering moment to see her drive away, knowing it was within my power to stop her from leaving. Weeks later, my wife had called twice to talk to her son, but never told me where she was or what plans she'd come up with. We, ex-Mrs. Pallur and I, found out that they moved into an apartment together out of state. I was really surprised that neither of them showed up to the court hearings, not even for custody. It was like they encouraged each other not to care. They didn't try to get custody or even visitation. Just before the 90-day limit was up, I agreed to let her and her kids stay on a yearly lease for less rent per month. Now I'm proud to say I live a completely self-sufficient life off the grid with my kids on our farm. Our exes split less than 2 years after moving in together, after losing all legal rights to their children.